vestibuli, and behind that opening curves nearly vertically downward along the mastoid wall. The mastoid or posterior wall (Parius mastoidea) is wider above than below, and presents for examination the entrance to the tympanic antrum, the pyramidal eminence, and the fossa incutis. The entrance to the antrum is a large irregular aperture, which leads backward from the epitympanic recess into a considerable air space, named the tympanic or mastoid antrum. The antrum communicates behind and below with the mastoid air cells, which vary considerably in number, size, and form. The antrum and mastoid air cells are lined by mucous membrane, continuous with that lining the tympanic cavity. On the medial wall of the entrance to the antrum is a rounded eminence, situated above and behind the prominence of the facial canal. It corresponds with the position of the ampullated ends of the superior and lateral semicircular canals. The pyramidal eminence (eminentia pyramidalis, pyramid) is situated immediately behind the fenestra vestibuli, and in front of the vertical portion of the facial canal. It is hollow, and contains the stapedius muscle. Its summit projects forward toward the fenestra vestibuli, and is pierced by a small aperture which transmits the tendon of the muscle. The cavity in the pyramidal eminence is prolonged downward and backward in front of the facial canal, and communicates with it by a minute aperture which transmits a twig from the facial nerve to the stapedius muscle. The fossa incutis is a small depression in the lower and back part of the epitympanic recess. It lodges the short crus of the incus. The carotid or anterior wall (Parius carotica) is wider above than below. It corresponds with the carotid canal, from which it is separated by a thin plate of bone perforated by the tympanic branch of the internal carotid artery, and by the deep petrosal nerve which connects the sympathetic plexus on the internal carotid artery with the tympanic plexus on the promontory. At the upper part of the anterior wall are the orifice of the semicanal for the tensor tympani muscle, and the tympanic orifice of the auditory tube, separated from each other by a thin horizontal plate of bone, the septum canalus musculotuberi. These canals run from the tympanic cavity forward and downward to the retiring angle between the squama and the petrous portion of the temporal bone. The semicanal for the tensor tympani (semicanalus and tensoris tympani) is the superior and the smaller of the two. It is cylindrical and lies beneath the tegmen tympani. It extends on to the labyrinthic wall of the tympanic cavity, and ends immediately above the fenestra vestibuli. The septum canalis musculotuberi (processus cochleariformis) passes backward below this semicanal, forming its lateral wall and floor. It expands above the anterior end of the fenestra vestibuli, and terminates there by curving laterally, so as to form a pulley over which the tendon of the muscle passes. The auditory tube (tuba auditiva, Eustachian tube) is a channel through which the tympanic cavity communicates with the nasal part of the pharynx. Its length is about 36 mm, and its direction is downward, forward, and medialward, forming an angle of about 45 degrees with the sagittal plane, and one from 30 to 40 degrees with the horizontal plane. It is formed partly of bone, partly of cartilage and fibrous tissue. The osseous portion (pars osseo tubi auditivi) is about 12 mm in length. It begins in the carotid wall of the tympanic cavity, below the septum canalis musculotuberi, and gradually narrowing ends at the angle of junction of the squama and the petrous portion of the temporal bone, its extremity presenting a jagged margin which serves for the attachment of the cartilaginous portion. The cartilaginous portion (pars cartilaginea tubi auditivi), about 24 mm in length, is formed of a triangular plate of elastic fibrocartilage, the apex of which is attached to the margin of the medial end of the osseous portion of the tube. while its base lies directly under the mucous membrane of the nasal part of the pharynx, where it forms an elevation, the torus tubarius or cushion, behind the pharyngeal orifice of the tube. The upper edge of the cartilage is curled upon itself, being bent laterally so as to present on transverse section the appearance of a hook. A groove or furrow is thus produced, which is open below and laterally, and this part of the canal is completed by a fibrous membrane. The cartilage lies in a groove between the petrous part of the temporal and the great wing of the sphenoid. This groove ends opposite the middle of the medial pterygoid plate. The cartilaginous and bony portions of the tube are not in the same plane, the former inclining downward a little more than the latter. The diameter of the tube is not uniform throughout, being greatest at the pharyngeal orifice, least at the junction of the bony and cartilaginous portions, and again increased towards the tympanic cavity. The narrowest part of the tube is termed the isthmus. The position and relations of the pharyngeal orifice are described with the nasal part of the pharynx. The mucous membrane of the tube is continuous in front with that of the nasal part of the pharynx, and behind with that of the tympanic cavity. It is covered with ciliated epithelium, and is thin in the osseous portion, while in the cartilaginous portion it contains many mucous glands, and near the pharyngeal orifice a considerable amount of adenoid tissue, which has been named by Gerlach the tube tonsil. The tube is opened during deglutition by the salpingopharyngeus and dilatator tubi. The latter arises from the hook of the cartilage and from the membranous part of the tube, and blends below with the tensor villi palatini. End of Section 57.